We should be live now. Okay, we are. Check. Wonderful. Hello, everybody. It is nice to be back. Let me go tweet out that we are live. And then we can let everyone come in and we'll get started. I hope everyone's having a pleasant Sunday so far. And let me know how you guys are doing. I'm doing pretty well today. It has been a good weekend so far. Okay, I'm glad that everyone can hear me. Wonderful. Hello, Oliver. Hello, Safa ladies. Michael, I'm glad that this is good background noise for you. And I'm glad that everyone's coming in so far. So I thought that I would take advantage of the fact that during my debating days in college and high school that I always loved foreign affairs and foreign policy. As I mentioned on stream and in other videos, that I have always had a preference for geopolitics and sort of international relations. In my freshman year of high school, I read George Friedman's The Next 100 Years, and I sort of fell in love with the idea of how geography, economics, and history all play a role in how we predict international relations. So I thought that I'd put something together and talk about some of the questions that I've been asked on stream and other foreign policy discussions, as well as on Twitter. So I put together a little PowerPoint presentation for you all, and I figured that we could have a fun time examining a couple of questions, and then I have something fun planned for you all at the end that is very on brand. Jonathan, hi, I'm glad that you could stop by and say hello. And I hope that everyone will enjoy what we talk about today. So let me go share screen. Let me take a look here. There we go. And then view, present. So yeah, I have put together a look at two questions that I get asked a lot when we talk about foreign policy and relations to what's currently going on in the world, specifically in terms of Russia, and then, of course, the China question. Andrew, hello. I just saw that you had subscribed, so hello. I'm glad that you could join us. And I hope that I can provide an entertaining as well as informative presentation of these two questions that I have put together for you all today. Dan, it's good to see you. I'm glad that you managed to make it on time and live. So with all of us pouring in now, I can see that we're climbing up in the numbers, so we'll get started very shortly. But yeah, so let's take a look at the question, geopolitical forecasting. Like, what are we talking about? We're taking a look at geography, economics, history, international relations, and trying to take a look at how history, geography, and those other factors allows us to provide some sort of prediction, or at least a baseline as to how national and state actors will respond to ongoing events. And of course, the two hot button topic issues, of course, for anyone who lives in the West is sort of what is Russia and China doing? And with that, I'm going to get started. And I decided I will start with Russia first. And the question that has been brought on is, with the wake of Russia increasing its influence in Eastern Europe, you have pipeline issues, and you have, of course, its influence in Syria and other parts of the Middle East. The question becomes, is Russia going to become a resurgent power, especially with an influence over the continent? And I thought that I would take a look at this question in the case for a resurgent Russia, both at the case for and the case against, and then we can have a conversation on it, as well as provide you some of my analysis on the issues at hand. So I provided this little PowerPoint, and if you can't read it all, don't worry. I'll be going through the PowerPoints here. But we'll get started on the case for. So the argument for Russia as a major power is primarily oriented around sort of the fact that Russia has been very much following the foundations of geopolitics, the 1995 work from Alexander Dugin, sort of to the letter. And I don't blame them. You have to understand that at the end of the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, there was a lot of pressure from the European project as well as the United States to let Russia, develop into its own and try not to let them feel the pressure of encroachment. At the time, there were several diplomatic promises made that the United States and the European Union would not move further eastward towards what was the former Soviet republics, the Balkans, and others. And since then, we have seen significant advances of NATO moving further and further eastward. We have seen the European Union put more and more pressure on Lithuania, Belarus, and the Ukraine, to a point now where we're sort of seeing a color revolution in Belarus. And of course, Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. Of course, we've seen with the annexation of Crimea, the soft proxy conflict that is currently going on inside the Crimean Peninsula, and of course the ongoing territorial issues that exist within. Now, in doing so, the West has definitely encroached upon Russia in what is considered the iridescent territories of the former Soviet republics, and in turn has created issues of the idea that the Kievan Rus, as well as other aspects of Russia's white Russia, this greater expansive ethnic Russian territory, Estonia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, states that were formerly of the Russian Empire and, of course, of the Soviet Union. These were geopolitical and geographic buffer states between the European powers of the time, Austro-Hungary, Germany, France, England, and Finland, against Russia's own territorial borders inside its own country. And in doing so, Russia has begun to expand its sphere of influence post-fall of the Soviet Union. So I want to talk about now the case for why I think Russia could resurge itself as a major European power within the continent. And the first one, of course, is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, it is a major natural gas pipeline that has been under the works. It's, I believe, an $11 billion project from Gazprom that is meant to supply Germany and sort of bypass Ukraine to provide natural gas, oil, and energy resources to Western Europe. Now, those who are with the Atlantic Council, NATO, and others have been adamant that this pipeline not go through and be passed. I know that previous administrations, as well as the current administration under Biden with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, has made it very clear that they have threatened sanctions against Germany and other European allies if this were to be passed. To a point where even now the German Green Party has made it a party platform that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will not be passed for environmental reasons, but given the overall status of the Green Party inside Germany, as well as their American influence in the area, I don't know how likely that'll happen. Because of this, we see that the United States and the EU's ties are already strained. They've been strained since the Trump administration due to Trump's more nationalist and pressure towards European nations to put more into their own money in defense rather than be reliant on US dollars, to a point where both Germany and France under Merkel and Macron have said, hey, we need to be more dependent on ourselves rather than Europe or the United States, but we'll get into that later. But most likely the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is going to happen regardless of Americans' threat of sanctions, and definitely because the Germans would have a bountiful access of resources and the Russians would have that influence. So I think that this is going to be taking advantage of one of Russia's greatest strengths as a world power, which is going to be its natural resources, whether it's access to rare earth minerals, access to lumber, and of course right now access to natural gas and oil, especially as the United States has cut back on its own domestic production. And in doing so, we're going to see this pipeline decrease American influence in the area and bring more of Russian political influence into the continent itself, not just the Balkans and Eastern Europe. The second issue that I thought was important is sort of the near abroad, the ethnic relations. If there's one thing that we've noticed when it comes to Belarus and Ukraine, and especially with what's going on in Crimea over the last 5 years, has been the increasing use of ethnic relations. I don't want to call it like the Lebensraum or ethnic Germans from our mid-century German counterparts, but there is a lot of things to be said that are comparable, especially when you have the Russian ethnic identity being shared by many in Eastern Ukraine, to a point where they identify more with Russians. Their language is Russian more so than it is Ukrainian. And there is a longing desire, of course, for ethnic separation and to be alongside with the Russian government. So we see a strong use of ethnic relations with the near abroad of these iridescent former Soviet republics. And I think that that will be important for Russia in the future, both in terms of manpower to have in the future by adding more people to your population. Not only are you increasing the likelihood that they're going to be on your side for military and political endeavors, but you now have the ability to level, ethnic relations back to your own people. And if there's one thing that we've noticed in Eastern Europe, and by extension Balkans and the European continent in general, it is that ethnic ties are still a very important factor in political relationships in the European continent. And I think that we're going to see more of that in the future from Russia, especially as they try to expand themselves in the near future. Shrouded Hills asks, how exactly is Russia gaining influence in Eastern Europe when they've made their two biggest peoples, the Poles and the Ukrainians, their internal arch enemies over Crimea? So my response to that would be, one, you still have the ethnic Russian issue, and then two, keep in mind that I believe while Poland does view Russia as an existential threat, keep in mind that this is only going to be necessarily framed in the terms of how long they can keep things going with the Peace and Justice Party in power. Keep in mind that the right-wing government of Poland, of course, has been adamant for American support, not so much of their left-leaning counterparts. However, I would see that Poland will be in the future a long-standing issue over Crimea as well as Russian expansion. And I wouldn't blame them. Poland has historically been sort of the whipping boy between Russia and the continent for centuries. And I would see that being a potential geopolitical flashpoint in the future. Whether or not Russia tries to find a way to, increase its political influence in the area, either through energy or through diplomatic relations, it would behoove the Russian government to do so if they wish to assert themselves as a power, but I would believe that it would make a central issue. As for the Ukrainians, keep in mind that Ukraine is heavily divided more or less between East and West. And the question becomes is how long can Europe and the United States afford to maintain its proxy conflict, especially with the transference of weapons before things either get too hot or it spills over. I do not see a diplomatic solution at hand for that conflict, especially as the Russians continue to advance their way into that area. So I think that what will inevitably happen is that some sort of concessions will be made by the West in the future. Whether or not that actually happens is unknown, but I do see that as sort of the strategy right now coming out of the current government in Russia, is to sort of just bleed them dry. Tequila Warlord says, I'm curious as to what would become of Russia post-Putin. He's really designed the state around himself. Don't think there's someone with equal to replace it. It never ends well with no good successor. And that sort of becomes the question. I know there's been talk of Putin stepping down after a certain point in time, I think 3 or 4 years from now, which is why I think he's doing everything he can to sort of facilitate a state apparatus to function with or without him, whether it's, financial incentives to increase the birth rate or to increase military spending or its icebreaker money. But that will be curious to see what happens in the future, which is why I think there's going to be a lot more sort of aggressive expansionist attitudes while Putin is still in power in order to take a hold of what he can. But yeah, the near abroad, I think we'll definitely see more, especially through political proxies like we're seeing in Ukraine and Belarus. Not to mention, more recently, there has been the vaccine diplomacy of, I think it's called the Sputnik 5, Russia's own version of the vaccine against the coronavirus that they've been exporting out to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and the Ukraine. So we're definitely seeing a significant increase of Russia's use of soft power, which is something that they typically do not do aside from perhaps their relationship with the Orthodox Church. So it's very interesting to see that that is working to a degree, especially after the AstraZeneca vaccine has been put sort of on, hold in Western European countries. So we're seeing the Russians, play with vaccine diplomacy, especially with the near abroad of former Soviet republics. And I believe it's working to a significant degree. So those are some arguments I think that we can see for what's happening in terms of Russia being a resurgent power. But the other thing that works in Russia's favor, of course, is the post-Trump pivot since 2016. Europe has been increasingly trying to be more independent of American influence. They are pulling away from the dollar. and we're seeing a decreased influence of the Atlantic Council, which is sort of the political wing of NATO and the Americans overall. So despite the fact that Trump had managed to succeed in getting a lot of these European countries to put more money into their own self-defense, you are seeing plenty of people advocate, like Emmanuel Macron as well as Angela Merkel, who are saying that a European Union military is necessary. And while I'm against this idea, I think that what Brexit has shown is that the EU will make it harder and harder for any nation to leave, which makes the likelihood of a European Union military happening, whether we like it or not, to be less dependent upon the United States. And in doing so, Eurosceptic wings of the party may be more, this is a political wedge issue that I think Russia politically could take advantage of in order to, push the U.S. further out of Europe, while at the same time weakening the European Union's resolve for a military, especially because Euroscepticism is still a widespread issue. You have widespread revolts against their governments over lockdowns. There's a soft power issue here that the Russians, I think, can definitely take advantage of. Next, we have the icebreakers. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Russia has the largest supply of nuclear-powered icebreakers to go through the Arctic oceans and the North Sea, which allows them to facilitate greater trade routes along the Arctic Ocean and the North Poles area. They have more icebreakers than the United States or Canada, and I think their closest counterpart, if I recall correctly, I believe is Norway or Finland, one of the two. But what this is indicative of is that they're going to have new opportunities to forge trade, especially as we see, the ice inside the Arctic Ocean and the North Pole area, continue to melt. You are going to see a greater dependency on icebreakers, especially for international trade, especially if things between Russia, the United States and China either gets, too hot, or trade relations continue to sour off with our current issues with this administration and the Trump administration. The North Pole region is going to be vital for trade, especially as a way to become less dependent upon the Americans and less dependent upon the U.S. Navy's control of global trade routes. This is going to be Russia's way forward in order to instigate greater international trade, and that'll be something that they can control. And in doing so, it's going to provide an opportunity for greater influence in the region, making them more of a likelihood of a resurgent power in the area. So I think the icebreaker issue is definitely going to be something that will work in the future. These are my general arguments, I think, for Russia as a resurgent power. And then the last but not least is its Turkish relationship. The relationship between Turkey and Russia has been testy at best, especially from 2013 onwards when it comes to Turkey's tentative relationship inside NATO. And in doing so, you've seen them shoot down Russian aircraft. However, lately, Russia has been able to take advantage of Turkey's increasingly Islamo-nationalist attitudes, and in turn has been selling them weapons, anti-air missiles, and of course, Soviet surplus of weaponry, which has, further strayed Turkey away from the European Union and the United States, despite originally having negotiations to join the European Union, despite having itself as a NATO ally. These pushback away from the West has allowed Turkey to be entered almost strongly within Russia and China's sphere of influence. And in doing so, you now have a strong anti-Western bloc that was originally sort of the gateway into the Middle East as sort of a democratized Arab state is no longer the case. You have a more, modernized Islamic nationalist country with strong diplomatic and military relations to Russia and its technology, which allows it to move further and further into Russia's sphere of influence. And in doing so, Russia can definitely make the case as a geopolitical power, because Russia can easily influence Turkey at that point with, the migrant crisis that's currently going on. Erdogan has already threatened it to, turn on the pressure valve and let more migrants come into Western Europe. Russia can easily serve itself as a broker in this case, making itself a greater geopolitical power within that region. So those are the arguments I've listed out based on my research for the case as to what would make Russia a resurgent power in the area. Now, the case against. So what we see is a manpower shortage. So despite the fact that they haven't managed to successfully annex more territory, and Russia's birth rate, I believe right now, is at 1.59 births for every woman, I believe it's still below the replacement rate. And despite Putin's attempts to maintain, financial and economic incentives to provide a higher birth rate to get it to 1.79, it has not yet been achieved, despite his attempts to do so. So there will be a demographic problem that you're going to see across the West unless the migrant crisis continues. But it will affect their ability to project power in terms of hard power, the military, into other areas without the use of either mercenary or, third-party groups and ethnic groups that we've seen in the past. But there is going to be a demographic problem. Unless the birth rate issue is addressed, you are going to see some difficulties in getting that out there. The second issue is that it's going to be, of course, continuous American and European encroachment, and I'll get to that in a second. I do want to answer some questions. So let's see here. As an American, I think it's about time Europe saves itself. I'm inclined to agree. I think the Russians are just fine, and I want them to be okay, like I do all peoples. Is Putin a bad guy? Hell, probably most leaders are, but I still hope for the best while preparing for the worst. Absolutely. I have no problem with Russia personally. I think Putin, of course, is a bad guy, but I think if anything that we've seen in the last 25 years of Western foreign policy, it is better to keep the secular bad guy in place than to have, sectarian, anarchy that we see, especially in the Middle East. Does Erdogan remaining? Does this depend on Erdogan remaining in power? To a degree, although I think with the fact that you have Erdogan in such a, I wouldn't say a cult of personality, but he's definitely facilitated in Islamic nationalism. Even if Erdogan were to die or to be ousted, I think that what we would see replace Erdogan is someone who's probably much more of a hardliner. If anything, that probably benefits Russia more. But back to the presentation. So you have continuous American and European encroachment. And so you have the EU, proxy conflicts, and Navalny types. Just as I've mentioned earlier that Russia's strategy is sort of to bleed the West out, I think at the end of the day, the West still has more money to put its influence on, the near abroad as well as Russia itself. And even though Navalny has been imprisoned, and I think it was laughable that he quoted Harry Potter and Rick and Morty at his own appellate trial, I think that there's nothing that will stop the United States and sort of that Western Five Eyes intelligence community from putting in another Navalny type year after year after year. Especially when historically, the CIA tried to kill Castro 50 some odd times and failed each time. I think it will not stop the Western intelligence apparatus from trying to put in a regime change, political replacement inside the Russian government, which of course destabilizes it, not in the way that Atlantic Council and intelligence community types want to, because they would love to replace Vladimir Putin. But what it does is that it prevents Russia from asserting itself as a stable political apparatus outside to garner further allies. Anytime that there's a domestic interference or an internal issue at home, it makes it very hard to project a power and influence abroad. And I think that the Western apparatus currently can still have its capacity to do that time and time again, over and over. Especially with the European Union trying to facilitate its own military and be less dependent upon NATO. I think that may, if it were to pass, it will cause more tension than it will anything else, especially because no one wants to risk a hot power, a kinetic hot war with nuclear armed states like Russia or France. I don't think that that's something that would want to happen, but it would increase tensions and put things at a standstill. And then, of course, last but not least is proxy conflicts. We're already seeing that prop up again in Belarus, where I've already been seeing it in Ukraine, in the Donbass area. I don't think that it's going to, I don't think Russia can afford to maintain the lengthy, long drawn out conflicts that they can. And we've been seeing it for 5 years in Ukraine, but if they were managed to put forward a sort of multi-front conflict, say they start putting out anti-Russian sentiments in Estonia, especially if they've moved more westward in recent years, we're already seeing it in Belarus. The question then at that point becomes is how long can Russia hold out? And I think that that's a significant argument that you can see against Russia as a resurgent power. And then last but not least is growing Chinese hegemony, especially as China increases its influence with its Silk Road initiatives, as well as its diplomatic presence inside the Middle East. They've put more pressure in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, which of course is on pretty much Russia's front door. And in doing so, it makes it harder for Russia to exert influence into Europe when, of course, its southern areas of former Soviet republics that are bordering the Middle East are now potentially being encroached upon by Chinese South power influence. Despite the fact that the Chinese and Russians have a strong diplomatic relationships, in part because they are anti-Western in nature, Russia's own predominant aspect for, geopolitical and geographic, hegemony of its own independence would provide a significant issue, especially as China continues to increase its influence both in Europe as well as the Middle East. And its influence in Europe, of course, is growing due to their use of 5G technology. Huawei is making advances. Last I checked, the United Kingdom, which is no longer inside the European Union, is, of course, one of the few countries that has joined the United States and the European continent to reject Huawei and 5G technology after significant pressure from the United States. Other nations, not so much. And in doing so, Russia is now going to have to compete with the second largest economy and second largest military power outside of the United States in its own backyard of the European continent, which I think will play a significant speed bump in any sort of advances that Russia wants to make in its own telecommunications technology and its own political influences in the area. So I think that that's what we're seeing right now. So to review things, I think those are the two cases that we have for resurgent Russia as a major power, the case for and the case against. Depending on how well Russia can effectively respond to American and European encroachment, I think that their victory in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, however, because I don't think the American sanctions will do anything to change the Europeans' minds, I think that you're going to see natural gas and energy be their primary way of exerting influence into the region. Will they be a major power on the world stage? Probably not. But in the matters of the European affairs, I do think in the future we are going to see a significant, use of energy politics as well as ethnic politics playing a role in the area. At the end of the day, do I think that they'll be a global power? No. Do I think that they're going to have a lot more influence in the future in European affairs? Yes. So I'm going to look through some comments now and take a look here. Russia has already bitten off more than they can chew, probably for the reasons I listed in the case against, whether it's demographics or the current lopsided asymmetric conflict that we're seeing between Russia and the West. Michael Nochter asks, how has Russia's support for Syria impacted them? And I think again, keep in mind that Syria is an important geopolitical target for Russia because it allows them to have a warm water port into sort of the Adriatic as well as the Mediterranean, which allows them to, patrol southern parts of Europe, Italy, Greece, that area, as well as Turkey. So Syria, supporting Syria and Assad has been beneficial because, one, it's allowed them to bleed the West dry. And I think that's what they're going to be. In as much as they are a paper tiger globally, there are a lot of things in Russia's favor, both with the icebreakers to sort of de-incentivize and sort of divest themselves away from Western-oriented trade, and as well as the leadership of the United States Navy, because we're still years behind before having the same number of icebreakers as them. So energy and ethnicity is going to play a huge role in the future. I do not think they'll be a global power, but they will be a regional hegemon. And of course, they are a nuclear-powered, a nuclear-armed state. So at the end of the day, they're still going to have a sway and influence. They still have their permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, for what that's worth. They still have the ability to veto. So they will still be a significant power in the time being. I just think that in the future, they're going to have a greater influence over the continent, especially in terms of energy. So that concludes the Russian portion of today's little presentation. If you guys have any more questions or comments, I'm all for it, because I think that this is some important things to talk about, whether you live in the United States, whether you live in Europe. How we look at Russia and how we treat them is important, because Russia has always been caught between two worlds, caught between the European continent and then caught within its own unique culture. And especially post-fall of the Soviet Union, their return to religiosity has given them a cultural avenue of power, especially for ethnic and soft power arguments, as we mentioned in the case for. Yiz says, so is Russia definitely on the short list of most powerful countries? Yes, by nature of being a nuclear power, as well as its technology, because of the fact that they've had, 70 some odd years virtually being isolated as the Soviet Union, we have now seen them be more innovative than imitative. If there's one thing that we can be said about the Russian military is that they are an incredibly innovative nation, and they are incredibly innovative in their technology, and they're not as reliant upon salvaging from U.S. tech or intellectual property theft as their Chinese counterparts. Tequila Warlord says, if the U.S. were truly a Chad country, we'd have nuclear-powered icebreaker aircraft carriers by now. From the Obama administration to the Trump administration, there has been, every time the National Defense Authorization Act gets reauthorized, so there's always more and more money put into nuclear-powered icebreakers. But we're still, I think, 5 to 10 years behind getting them, out to sea, and we've borrowed some from the Canadians as well as from, I believe, the Finnish. So we are definitely behind in that area. But that is the Russian portion for today's presentation. The only people in Russia who've got places of worship who go to places of worship are Muslims. I want to say yes and no, just due to the growing influence of the Orthodox Church, and at the same time, Russia's increased crackdown on Islamic terrorism. See what's been happening in Georgia and Azerbaijan. Then I'm going to move on to the second question, or the second topic of discussion that I get asked a lot on stream and in conversations of foreign policy, which is the China question. Are they a paper tiger, or are they something more? And of course, the term paper tiger, ironically enough, is a Chinese phrase, sort of to say that it is, we're strong on paper, but weak in real life. So when it comes to all bark and no bite, so to speak. So I would like to list out the reasons for and against Russia being a paper tiger or a possible global hegemon in the coming years. We talk a lot in the West and in the United States. It's been a popular political issue since the Trump administration and the campaign trail, that the issue that we need to be pivoting towards is China, not necessarily other parties like Russia. I mean, keep in mind in 2012, the issue of Russia was the primary issue. We made Russia the biggest issue thanks to electoral concerns post-2016. But however, the issue remains and still remains that it is the Chinese. So I wanted to talk about the case for China being a paper tiger, and then we'll go into the counter-arguments in a minute. So historically, China has been a regional and not global power, and not a global power. And what I mean by this is that every time that China has been on the precipice of global hegemony, there has always been an internal issue that drags them back in, or they purposefully pull themselves back into a more isolationist standpoint. Now, keep in mind, this does not mean that they're no longer completely isolationist from the world, or that they don't focus on their immediate geographical interests, such as the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, or other parts of the Pacific Islands in the area. It is just that globally, it has not entrenched itself as much into the West and other nations as it has in the past. So despite the fact that we are seeing these advances here, there has always been a historical and cultural reason to withdraw inward. And I think that that tells us that we are probably near that precipice once again, and that there will be internal issues that are going to cause it to become more inward than it will outward. Its ability to project power will be significantly reduced for internal and cultural reasons. And I have one of those reasons listed down below. Whether or not they're going to actually buck this trend, I think remains to be seen, but there are numerous internalized issues, as well as international pressures on said internal issues, that I think will allow them to continue on with a trend of being more regional focused than they will be globally, which is good for both the US and the West overall, because despite the fact that we don't like the current state of the regime and the cultural exports that the United States puts out in the Western world, it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. And my fear is that there's going to come a day where we're going to look at China like liberators. And I think that one needs to look at what China has done to the Koreans in the past in terms of regional wars and conflicts to realize that they are not going to treat you like you will not view them as a liberator. They will be an oppressor. There's a lot of psyop stuff going on, and I think it's important to remind a lot of people on the right that these people are not our allies. China is an underdog, but they do make a lot of good chess moves. They do. And Great White Lobster, they do. And I'll be talking about that in a little bit on the global hegemon argument in a minute. But one thing that I have also noticed is that they are imitated and not innovated in their technology. So despite great investments and their, pushing to create more and more of their navy to try and outnumber the United States in terms of ships, they are heavily reliant on trade and intellectual property theft. They are not innovative yet enough to be making significant advances on Western technical prowess, despite the recent billions that they have poured in and a significant double-digit numbers of GDP spending towards their military and research like quantum computing. They are still heavily reliant on the Western tech hegemony, and they are going to continue to be imitative and not innovative. This is strategically not a good thing for the Chinese. This leaves you vulnerable to, of course, technological defenses. Of course, there's an unknown amount of cyber conflict going on, both from the United States and other Western powers. And of course, the IP theft has become a weaponized issue to the West. Both parties tentatively agree that that's an issue. And of course, the private sector has been more aware of this and has been responding in kind. But when you have an imitative force and not an innovative one, it makes it incredibly difficult to survive on your own, especially when you are now in a hot kinetic conflict that requires you to be reliant on domestic research and manufacturing. And when you don't have access to resources and you don't have access to outside information, even with the internet and even with trade, when there's sanctions put in place and there's going to be a likelihood of decreased travel between the two countries, it will clearly be indicative that will be a problem for China in the long run, both in a technological and military standpoint. Yeah, definitely an issue of regional issues. Of course, like all of their military aircraft are copies. I do agree. I already feel impressed without the Chinese. Certainly are. GSP, we are. China's economy, its main safeguard against internal issues, is propped up by global interests. And in turn, they prop up said global interests. And I think that's running on fumes, though. We'll talk about that when we hit the demographics issue. They are not to be underestimated, of course not. And there's the reason, I list the reasons why we shouldn't underestimate them in the global hegemon arguments. Given their massive defense advantage and the fact that the U.S. doctrine is throw carriers at them, they could absolutely deny the U.S. victory in a war. Oh, absolutely. Which is why their ability to have a regional influence is probably what they want, because if you can deny arguably the strongest military on Earth a chance for actual strategic victory through a defensive network of artificial islands, carriers, and political influence in other Asiatic states, it becomes incredibly difficult for the West and by extension the United States to achieve victory. So they'll definitely be able to achieve a significant regional advantage. If China is so GSP asks, if China is so unlikely to own the future, why be afraid of them taking over America? Because they don't necessarily need to win through hard power or offensive conflict. If you can see one of the points I have on sort of the increasing cultural and political capture of Western institutions, they're sort of hoping for an accelerationist collapse here in the West, which will allow them to have greater influence over here. If you can take your enemy out without winning, without firing a shot, you'll be doing just fine, and you'll be winning there. Michael asks, what are the chances of a war between Taiwan and China? Will the USA get drawn in? If Trump were still in office, I would say the US wouldn't get drawn in, although with the current administration and its hawkishness and sort of its traditional neoliberal interventionism, I'm not so sure that would happen. But I'm going to continue on. The last but not least is that you have a demographic time bomb. You have a birth rates and a class issue. So China's increasing liberalized market structure has been heavily dependent upon a booming population. You have roughly 325 million people, which is roughly the same size of the population of the United States, that are over 65 right now as we speak. but they don't really have the strong social security safety nets and are reliant upon the cultural practice of the young take care of the elderly. But of course, China has the same problem that we have in the West, is that things are unaffordable with forced relocation into the cities. You were seeing the, cheap migrant labor class that would work in the factories no longer want that kind of lifestyle, the same way that we have many urbanites here in the West that don't want that kind of lifestyle. And in doing so, a declining birth rate with an increase in elderly population with no safety nets, you have a time bomb of unable to project power because you don't have the military bodies to do it. You don't have the bodies to produce domestic manufacturing for war goods in total war. And you don't have the ability to produce an economy that can maintain its outstretching sphere of influence that we're seeing with its foreign direct investments in Africa, with its investments in the Middle East, with the Silk Road initiatives. You are going to lose the ability to produce the necessary goods and capital that you would need to maintain these investments and to maintain these relationships. And in doing so, this is going to be one of the biggest issues that causes China internally to withdraw in. And this is outside of the ongoing Western identification that Steve Bannon has made about divesting Western manufacturing away from China. Now, of course, the argument that you hear a lot from Atlantic Council types is like, oh, well, we should go with India because India is the greatest democracy, like the largest democracy in terms of population. They still have a friendly relationship with the Chinese diplomatically. They've recently signed border security agreements with the Chinese. I think that you would need to divest and reshore your financial interests and your manufacturing power back within your own countries. Because if you don't do that and you put it in India, then India just becomes another aspect of leverage that the Chinese has over them. But you do have a demographic issue, and I think that would happen in the future. But let me go read through some comments here now. Let's see here. Swiss intelligence leak predicts America can continue to losing power and prestige into the 2020s. I mean, we've been losing it since the Obama administration, if not earlier. I wouldn't be surprised, but unless we move further rightward in our national strategy, I don't see us getting any of that back. Let's see here. Yellow Lantern asks, do you think the U.S. losing to China would play out like Russia lost to Japan? The U.S. reminds me of late imperial Russia. If the U.S. were to lose to China, I would argue that that's a very similar perception. However, keep in mind that Russia became, poor leadership plus the issues of ending serfdom. Russia would later become one of the greatest, industrial powers, of course, propped up by the West, thanks to Lend-Lease in the 1930s and 40s. If anything, that might be actually good for us, but I don't want to be around for the interim when things get really bad. Let's see here. Manufacturing is not coming back, but it's moving away from China to Vietnam or Indonesia, which, thankfully, the United States has significant cultural capital in those areas, which is why I think it'll probably be beneficial to us. Tequila Warlord says, China knows about all these problems, and their strategy is to basically do everything they can to stay ahead of entropy. Yes, and accelerate the entropy here in the West, which is why I'm going to transition now to my arguments as to what they'll be for a global power. So it's increasing cultural and political capture of Western institutions. You're seeing this in academics, the American political class, and the weaponization of the Western culture war. So what are Confucius Centers? Confucius Centers are Chinese-sponsored academic goodwill, quote-unquote goodwill, exchange of information, centers and buildings and grants and monies that are sent to American and Western college institutions all over the United States. And they have been a hotbed for spies and for the Chinese government to recruit Western academics to leak proprietary information from U.S. government-granted fund projects in those universities. There has been a recent push by the United States to get rid of them and to kick them out, although that has not happened in its entirety yet. So they are still a significant thorn in the American side over doing so. And so it is definitely a political and cultural capture of a Western institution, which is academia. So if you want to see... If you work in the university sector, if you work in academia and the institution you work for has a Confucius Center, if there's anyone that you know that works in those centers, odds are they're probably a spy for the Chinese government, and you should report them to the authorities accordingly. And of course, the American political class. I mean, we've already seen it with representatives like Eric Swalwell and Dianne Feinstein. Whether you're sleeping with a Chinese spy or your driver and your secretaries have worked for the Chinese government, there are significant political captures of the American political class, especially along the Democratic Party. They are not as hawkish. So that's definitely an issue there. One thing of note about the Chinese elderly issues is that China's C word from Wuhan had mysteriously stricken down quite a large number of soon-to-retire population within major internal big cities. Yes, and then they get replaced by all the rural populations because they're not as farm-oriented as they used to be. So it's sort of this convenient way of replacing the elderly with just those who are not yet elderly, but they're still going to have this problem both due to birth rates and their lack of social safety net. But you are right, Melphis, they did kill quite a few of them. Unlike us, they just didn't report it. Vietnam and Indonesia are not a replacement for China, not by a long shot. No, they're not. But at the same time, they do provide, at least for now, I guess, a sort of a stopgap measure on the issue of industry and manufacturing. MW says, I actually attended a game night at a Confucius Center in uni. Lol. Well, just saying, that's where they recruit their spies, and that's where they get professors to leak proprietary information. But yeah, I mean, Chinese spies are definitely an issue, and of course, their political capture and pretty much the entire Democratic Party institution, between leaked information that we've seen in regards to how they're funding the DNC, between how they are, pretty much getting the intelligence committee to have Swalwell on there despite being compromised. We are clearly seeing this capture of the American political institution, and in doing so, it makes it incredibly hard for us to address things internally. The next issue that we have, of course, is the culture war. The Chinese have done a very good job at both mimetically and publicly making the culture war a international relations issue, to a point where most recently the Chinese government has said, like, don't look at us about, our Uyghur issue. Take a look at what the United States had done in slavery and Jim Crow. Like, it's the same thing that the Soviets did back during the Cold War, when we would call out the evils of communism and the issues around the millions that are dead. They would point to America's racial divides. And of course, if you've read Foundations of Geopolitics, even that has been mentioned by the Russians as to inflame and incite issues on racial tensions. And the Chinese are doing it very, very well. If you see any of the Chinese government's Twitter accounts and their media pages, the American issues of racial grievances and racial politics is front and center. The culture war is definitely a weaponized issue. Yeah, and as Yellow Lantern mentions in the chat, that's exactly what the Russians did, and they're going to keep doing it. And they have been weaponizing a lot of sort of the talking points that we see from the rad-lib SJW crowd. And by rad-lib, I mean radical liberal. I don't mean like Mr. Carson, our favorite rad-lib. But that's the issue. And that's where they're coming at. So, and that's the reason why I've mentioned earlier that their biggest way of support and to maintain that sort of like power in the world is by accelerating the entropy that we're already seeing here, which is why the culture war is both a foreign policy issue as well as it is a domestic politics issue, which is all the more reason why the right needs to quit infighting and just advance its issue. Because right now the openness and the neoliberal attitudes of egalitarianism, everything that we see that has been problematic of the current structure is just simply a weapon to be used against us. There needs to be a more closed-in sort of political system that I think makes it less likely to be influenced from outside sources. But until then, you are going to see the weaponization of the culture war in doing so, and it is much easier to divide. And as GSP points out, we could have prevented this. We could have prevented it in 1965 if we didn't pass that bloody Immigration Act, but we did, and here we are. The next issue I have, of course, is the Taiwan, Hong Kong, and what I call hills to die on. So you are in this catch-22 with the United States, because I know someone had mentioned Taiwan earlier. And so you have this catch-22 of, like, realistically speaking, we cannot defend Taiwan and we cannot defend Hong Kong. They have way too much of a defensive structure. Our ability to throw carriers at them is useless, and it does not help that the United States Navy is not as at military readiness as it used to be maybe 15 years ago. We are not in a position to wage an offensive conflict, and we are not in a position to make good on our promises that we have for Taiwan or for Hong Kong, despite our ongoing tweets and our ongoing rhetoric for these issues. And as Trump had made very clearly, the geographic distance between our naval bases and, our ability to project power on our supply lines, whereas, Taiwan is on China's, front door, they'll take it and they'll hold it. And it won't be like the Falklands. You won't be able to take it back. You won't be able to liberate it. It's not going to happen. So, but the catch-22 is that the United States either makes good on its promise to uphold, its position on Hong Kong and Taiwan, or it doesn't. And then if it doesn't, you then have the sort of neoconservative argument that I've been seeing from a lot of traditional foreign policy circles, is that, well, if the United States can't make good on its word on Hong Kong and Taiwan, how can it make good on its word for Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Australia? And then it reverberates to sort of this, domino effect of its allies, and how do we address those issues? So that's where we're at. Not to mention the increased support that the Chinese have been putting in towards Kim Jong-un's sister, the head of propaganda and torture and all that, because she's far more of a hardliner than Kim is. And I mean, the Kims aren't even talking to the American administration anymore. So that's where we're at. The Chinese look at them as a rogue province. I mean, we can go back in time from the years of Chiang Kai-shek, which, I mean, as someone who is not pro-China, long live Chiang Kai-shek, long live Taiwan. But that's what they're doing, is that they are creating these strategic rifts. As Focron points out, that's the catch-22, is that it would create a strategic rift. So either you make Taiwan the hill to die on, or you tell your allies that the United States no longer has its capacity to defend the area that it says it does so. So in doing so, it puts the U.S. in a strategic and diplomatic bind, which is, again, only accelerated by America's current cultural war and its political classes being pretty much bought off by the Chinese. Their whole strategy is to accelerate the entropy and to accelerate the decline, so they can win their territorial desires without firing a shot. Pager says, well, Prudentialist, we could just sneak 200 nuclear missiles into Taiwan and tell them if they invade, they'll be glassed. There's no way that we could sneak 200 nuclear weapons in there without that being noticed. There's just no way. It doesn't matter. We made a promise and we must uphold it. I agree, but the capacity to make good on that promise is incredibly difficult, and that's something that the Chinese have definitely capitalized on. But lastly, and not least, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that they can shrug off international pressure. Keep in mind that the neoliberal universalism that we so often lambast from the right is that we up the idea of human rights and democracy. Most recently, we've made wokeness the latest rendition of that human rights and universalism that we see out of the neoliberal interventionist model. But the Chinese shrug it off to a point now where they have managed to secure the institutional capture of world institutions, mainly through the United Nations, to criticize the U.S. more and more on its own human rights issues. And don't get me wrong, the U.S. has got problems, but not to the degree I would argue that the Chinese does. But we do have our own issues. But you have managed to successfully allow the United States, but they can shrug off these political and international pressures, despite the fact that Europe and the United States has talked about having sanctions on the Chinese and has sanctioned certain political characters. It doesn't stop them from continuing what they're doing, and certainly no one is willing to go to war over these issues. So despite the fact that we call upon the Chinese acting like mid-century Germans and having concentration camps, although the intelligence reports themselves have even been criticized by U.S. reporters as not being necessarily completely factual, their fact that they can shrug off such an international pressure puts them in a position where they do not need to worry about the consequences or optics that come out of the West in regards to that issue. So in doing so, they've managed to successfully put themselves in a position that asserts more power in the long run. So to take a look at the chat here now. Whoops, let me hide that real quick. I didn't mean to show. Would the USA ever give up Taiwan, and if it meant the Korean Peninsula was denuclearized and unified? Most likely not, simply because I don't think American political rhetoric and their position would allow them to do so. You would get the hawks on the right telling you that we can't give up on our promises, and then the left, probably wouldn't want to concede to the, a power. I don't think that would happen. I think that would be the smart and prudent thing to do. I don't think that'll ever happen, though. Melfa says, everyone praises Chiang Kai-shek and calls Taiwan the real China, but as a history buff, I know all too well about how the Kuomintang genocided the Japanese and the Japanese locals upon finding out the island was. Yes, they definitely did, but keep in mind, you have to, the Japanese definitely didn't do themselves any favors with what happened on mainland China as well as Manchuria in the 1930s and 40s, not to mention the rape of Nanking. I'm not surprised that happened. But yeah, I'm very familiar with what the Kuomintang did at the time as well. Already Death says that tax the Chinese when they try to invade. They do have enough ships for a full invasion. And if you strategically destroy transport ships, it hurts China the most. I think if you were trying to make international trade less dependent upon the South China Sea area, because that's one of the largest trade hotspots in the world, I think that you could successfully cripple their ability to project power in a capital sense, which is why I think it's all the more important that the United States fosters a stronger relationship with Russia on the nuclear icebreaker issue. It would literally take the entire U.S. fleet with a majority of the Air Force to defend Taiwan. They would take horrendous losses. Yep. Starting to wonder if the Soviets lost the Cold War, but the anti-communist forces won. Yes, Yellow Lantern, they did. And it doesn't help that the Soviets spent millions upon millions of dollars every year to influence Hollywood, to influence academia. Razorfist has a great video on Hollywood was always red. You should always do it. Based Populist jokingly says, why would you worry about China? Have you seen how diverse our military is? Oh, absolutely. Diversity is our strength. Remember that. Realistically, what is the proximity between us and World War III? I think we might be in 1937. I think that we are not in a position. I don't think global conflict is happening anytime soon. Although, as I've mentioned on previous streams and I've mentioned in previous videos, the theory of power transition theory tells me that conflict is pretty much all but inevitable. The nature of that conflict being kinetic, I'm not too sure. Ouchie says, I think World War III will start on the India-China border if it will ever start. I think the World War III will actually start with the India-Pakistan border because there are still skirmishes over Kashmir. In the last 5 years, actually the last 10 years, there have been an increased relationship between India and China, both diplomatically, but also on a codified border security agreement to decrease the likelihood of military skirmishes between India and China. The Western strategy will always be to destroy Russia and save China. It should be the opposite, GSP, but unfortunately, that won't be the case. But those are the arguments there that I have, and I think that they're a paper tiger, and they know it. However, they also know that we're a paper tiger as well, and they just know to light the match in the right place for the rest of us to burn up like rice paper, and that's where we're at. They are aware of the ongoing internal political divide inside the U.S., which weakens us, as well as our diplomatic allies and relationships to the area. And in turn, they can simply skirt past their own issue of their own internal problems, because our internal issues, our internal culture war, our own demographic issues will easily trump anything and everything that they have in terms of, political and external conflict. So is Pakistan the Italy of this war? Potentially. The influence of international Bolshevism worked well with the progressive religion of the quote-unquote cathedral because of similar ideological root, liberalism, and the Enlightenment. Yeah, that's pretty much the biggest issue that you see with a lot of post-left, post-liberal NRX crowd on that issue. Do you think Pakistan will be annexed? No, they're a nuclear-armed state. The likelihood of a nuclear-armed state ever being annexed forcefully would most likely mean the end of the world, because nukes are probably going to get used. So those are, but to conclude the paper tiger question, I think that China is a paper tiger, but they definitely have the capacity to light a match and burn up our own paper tiger, which gives them the advantage strategically, in the long game. So that's the end of my little presentation. Those are the two questions that I had. We spent half an hour on both of the issues, looking at the cases for and against. And I think we hit 50 people watching was our top number. So thank you all so much for coming in and saying hello. I greatly appreciate it. But if you guys have any questions or if you just want to talk for a little bit, I have one more slide, but I'm all open for Q&A, and I'll try my best to answer any questions that I have for you guys. They might be a paper tiger, but they act confidently. Yeah, I mean, unlike the United States currently, they can project confidence, and they can project a sense of what they know what they're doing. They have a strategy, and I mean, since 2014, they've had a strategy pretty much written by Xi Jinping's government of what they want to do with China for the next like 25 to 50 years. It was like a 400-something page report. It was incredibly detailed. And they have the confidence, they know what they're doing. But again, there are internal issues. They can skirt past them simply because they know exactly where our weaknesses are and how to take advantage of that. Does the cathedral support Israel's current administration? No, and in part the reason why is because we've seen sort of, the international left sort of argument coming out of here to get rid of the Likuds and the influence that they have over the West, specifically the United States. Keep in mind that they've tried and failed, but the cathedral apparatus is not a fan of the current government that exists inside Israel. Already, Death asks, what do you think is the best path forward to mitigate China? So the best path forward was like 30 years ago, and we kind of failed to do that. What we should have done is try to further foster a stronger Russian-American and Western Russo relationship, both in terms of trade, international relations, and security, which would have allowed a greater European bulk against China, especially because Russia borders on China. Russia's a nuclear power. Russia's a technologically advanced military state with its own technological innovations. It would have essentially allowed China to have the inverse of the American-Sino relationship during Nixon's, trip to China. It would have been, George H.W. Bush's trip to Russia. And in doing so would have allowed us to do that. The greatest strategy, of course, is to divest manufacturing back to the United States, increase our economic investment of capital within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and other nations like the Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, and while at the same time investing more into our Navy technologically to match their ongoing spending of percentage of GDP. And of course, in fostering a greater relationship with Russia, which means making concessions in Eastern Europe to ensure that Russia feels secure on its, western border, while its eastern borders are being fortified. That would be my pathway forward. Where's the slide for the EU? I didn't talk about the EU. I talked more so about Russia as an influence of a power. I do have one more slide, though, that's a little on brand for the prudentialist, so don't you worry. America believes that Europe belongs to them and not Russia. Therefore, the strategy is to destroy Russia and by not containing China. And yeah, that's the problem. That's definitely that was the issue. It was sort of this post-war neoliberal, Europe's ours, we're the global power, and in doing so, that's where we're at, and that's the issue. That's what bothers me is that the hubris of the post-war, left and right consensus of what would be called the New World Order or the liberal world order failed so hard in that issue. Do I think that the EU's cathedral is going rogue? I don't think that they're necessarily going rogue. I think that they're beginning to assert more power. They're practically a super state within themselves. As long as they can continue to raise taxes and at this point levy a military power, they meet the definition of a state, and that's where we're at. Let me see here. Will there be a Palestine in 50 years, or will Israel colonize and annex by then? I don't know. I think that they'll eventually conquer it by sheer military force or by simply making that area of Palestine uninhabitable. There have been numerous reports saying that between the wars, the destruction of infrastructure, you cannot survive in those areas without external support. If you eventually make it uninhabitable, you've earned the land. I think that there's an inevitability about that within the next 50 years. Wrangle Gang asks, what do you think the future holds for the V4 countries? I'm actually not familiar with that term. Visegrad Group, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic. I feel bad for not knowing that. Hungary and Poland are continuing to move further rightward politically, although Poland is incredibly pro-America, at least with the Peace and Justice Party. Whether or not they stay pro-America, I don't know. However, Poland is too independent and historically has been sort of the whipping boy of the continent and Russia to not view either side as their own like ally or treat them with any sort of respect. So Poland will be, and I hold with George Friedman's analysis, Poland will be a major power and potential flashpoint for future conflicts in Europe. As for Slovakia and the Czech Republic, I think, will stay towards the EU. Slovakia, I think, will move further towards Russia. And Hungary, unless they get rid of Alexander Kurz anytime soon, which I would expect a color revolution to come out of the EU from that, Hungary will still tentatively be pro-EU, but independent. They may partner more so with Poland in the future. Yes, Yiz is absolutely right. Remember, we have to use those terms specifically. It's not just this all Bond movie powerful. It's a mix of oligarchs, media press, the academia, the government. There's, Curtis Garvin has a great essay on his Substack, sort of explaining what it is in easy to understand terms. We like to use it to sort of just describe the elite, but it has a specific terminology, so keep that in mind. Melthus says, as a Europore, I can say that the EU cathedral is not going rogue. In fact, they're clamping down. Yes. Will any of the BRICS nations be relevant? Brazil will be relevant only because you have an increased amount of Chinese influence in South America, and Mercosur is receiving an influx of Chinese money. So there's definitely some of that in places there. India will probably be increasingly relevant as they modernize. Not to mention, they're a nuclear armed state with over 1 billion people. They're still going to be relevant. The BRICS will still play an important role. I think the only one that will probably slide into some kind of obscurity would be Brazil, especially with ongoing economic issues. And of course, the political hot, bed of fire that Mr. Bolsonaro remains to be in from international pressure. Thoughts on Peter Zahan? I'm aware of his consulting, and I'm aware of his thoughts and his reviews, but I haven't read enough of his work. I think I've only read bits and pieces of, Disunited Nations. I think he's interesting. I think he's a smart guy. He's partially kind of what I would like to do with my life. Peter Zahan is sort of the guy who's turned, a lot like George Friedman, who's managed to turn his analysis into a career, into something like that, a powerful consulting position. That's something I would love to do in real life, but that would require me to make this a brand or make my real life name a brand and start publishing again. But yeah, Peter's entire worldview burned to the ground when Biden won Lamau. But he didn't win. Let's be honest here. We had the Orange Man so bad we will literally fortify, and he didn't win. I'm sorry. I'm going to just say that now. Pedro asks, what do you think Canada's future will be? I don't know. It depends on how long Justin Trudeau stays in office. the amount of influence the Chinese has over Justin Trudeau is absolutely ridiculous. So it depends on whether or not the Conservatives or the People's Party of Canada can successfully pull their head out their ass and win a federal election again. But at the rate of immigration that Trudeau is doing, and essentially, you know, he wants what, like 1 million people a year. It's, I mean, Canada's gone. That's all I can say. Canada's gone. They're just a couple of years behind us. When Biden fortified, I'm gonna fortify. That was the Biden camp. Canada's future depends on America as much as China. Yes, but China's having greater influence. And Dan Normie is quoting Count Dooku, brave but foolish, my good friend. Would I be in favor of the Canada, the New Zealand, UK? Is that the conversation that they've been having about a free movement of peoples between Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK? Sort of the colonial Anglosphere, since America doesn't get to count. I'm not in favor of it because, I'm sorry, I don't need New Zealand's and Canada's brand of leftism ruining the UK and Australia any more than it has to. I don't want that. No, I'm not a fan of political unions. As much as I like as much as I enjoy the Anglosphere, Jacinda Ardern is too disgusting, and I do not need her having any more power or leverage over Canada, the UK, or Australia. Fuck that. We pretty much already have the Commonwealth through like the Five Eyes intelligence community, and we have NATO and all these other things. There's the Commonwealth still exists politically and strategically. It's just, I don't need this fucking commies having any more power. No, fuck it, no. Why does all this seem so similar to the Fallout timeline? Because there are days where I agree with Scott Adams, where it's just a simulation. Enjoy. Ardern is beautiful and strong and compassionate and vulnerable and fierce. Ugh. I'm sure you're saying that sarcastically, but yeah, I can't stand her. That nation of I'm sorry, New Zealand is a nation of sheep fuckers. I don't need their political influence anywhere. Rangel asks, you think Spain might have another major political crisis once again, like the 20s and 30s? They were this close, and you can't see, but I'm like pinching my fingers very close together. But they were this close to having another one with the Catalonia thing, but Spain and the European Union clamped down on that shit again, and they are not going to let that ever happen. Despite the fact that ethnic separatism inside Spain would probably cause an issue where that would happen. But I think that the power of the state apparatus, both within Spain and the EU, would prevent that from happening, despite the fact that Spain's economy has been in the shitter for like 20 years. That's where we're at. I don't see it happening. What would a boog in the U.S. result in? Not necessarily foreign interventionism, but you would definitely see the worst case scenario of what we feared would happen post-fall of the Soviet Union. But who knows? If it happens, then you will see most of international trade collapse because the U.S. can't project militarily because it has to deal with internal issues. And then you would have the problem of all of our foreign holdings and military bases would immediately be ripe for pickings because we're dealing with an internal issue. I just hope that doesn't happen. I would like a political solution, whether that's a divorce, balkanization, or we actually rout the left institutionally and we seize power. That would be nice. Shrouded Hill says, only when Germany stops paying for the Spanish social state. Yep. And I don't want that to, I mean, that'll happen eventually, right? Is that eventually I think the Germans will stop paying for the Spanish social state and tell people to pay up. Maybe when that stops, then things will get hot in Spain, but I don't think that'll happen anytime soon. And yeah, a boog in the U.S. would mean millions dead, and I don't want that to happen. I'm not an advocate for bloodshed, and I'm not an advocate for genocide or anything like that. I don't want that to happen. And of course, China and Russia would throw hands and get involved. But yeah, so I do have one more slide. and then we can keep chatting for a little bit because I've got time. It's a nice, pleasant Sunday afternoon. But I thought, being on brand, and since someone had mentioned it before, on previous streams, I usually have a couple of pictures of frogs in the background, so it's just not the avatar profile picture, just moving up and down when I talk. So last slide, frog facts. There we go. I thought this would be something a little cute to do. So I figured for all these streams at the end, I will just pick a different species of frog, and we'll just do a little facts on it. So we're going to do one on the ever so popular White's tree frog. Unlike most frogs that have vertical pupils, they have horizontal ones, and they have a fatty ridge over their eyes, which sort of makes them a little bulbous. And it's a distinctive feature of their species. They have a variety of colors, and they can be green, gray, white, and like most frogs, they have the ability to change color based upon their environment, but not as strong as other species. They're rather large frogs. They can range from anywhere from 3 to 4.5 inches, 7 to 11.5 centimeters. And they can live an incredibly long time, about 16 years, although the longest one on record has been 21 in human care. These guys are relatively inexpensive to take care of. With about $200 in American dollars, you can get the tank, the necessary equipment, and of course the bugs that you would need to feed and take care of these guys for years. They're adorable, and they're absolutely wonderful to have. They're one of the most popular frog species in the United States as a pet. They reach sexual maturity within their second year and are ready to lay eggs at that time frame. And the females are much, much larger than the male White's tree frog. So, and there's a picture of one of them. I thought it was cute as hell. And I think I'm going to start doing this at the end of every stream. Pedro's asking the right question. Oh, are they straight frogs? Yes, they're straight frogs. As long as you don't keep them away from industrial, water and chemicals, yeah, they'll be straight. We can't let the frogs turn gay. We can't let that happen. But yeah, those are White's tree frogs. I thought I would do this at the end. Some frogs hibernate. Does this one? They can, depending on the environment. So usually around the wintertime, they will. And it's important for a lot of first-time frog owners to not get panicky around spring and winter time. If they hibernate for a few weeks, they're not dead. So just keep that in mind. Forrest asks, do you think America's going the way of Germany in the 20s and 30s? Yeah, there's been a lot of comparisons to the Weimar Republic. I know that Academic Agent did a really good cigar stream with Charlemagne on the comparisons of the United States and the West to the Weimar Republic, and I would highly recommend that you watch that one. I agree with pretty much their analysis. We're already there. Although the Weimar was like 99.9% white. Yeah. So things are going to be a lot more divisive along ethnic lines here. But there are some adequate comparisons that we can see. I would recommend that you watch AA's cigar stream on that issue. The White's tree frog seems like a simp male feminist species because the females are bigger. I want more of a Chad frog. Well, I hate to break it to you, Pedro, but most animal species, especially amongst amphibians, that's normally the case. The females are larger in part because they have to accommodate more energy and hold their eggs and be in that area. But yeah. And the Dalhuck is right. It's technically brumation, not hibernations, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. But yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind if you're a first-time frog owner. Brumation's a thing. Do not get discouraged. They're not dead. Give it a couple of weeks. But Pedro, if you want a more Chad frog species, just wait till I do the next stream, and I'll have a different species at the end. But yeah, I thought that this would be cute to do at the end, since frogs are very much on brand for me. Plus, we did the BAP stream the other week, and we call each other our fellow frogs. What are my thoughts on the toad question? Toads are great. They're wonderful. Let me find that. There's a picture about toads that I think is pretty funny. Let me see if I can find it. But yeah, I have no problem with with toads at all. Alex Jones has entered the chat. But yeah, let me share the. I'll respond to the toad question with this. Can we still do conservation of endangered species without being communists? Yes. I am very much pro conservation in all shapes and forms. And I think that it's important for us on the right to be pro conservation without necessarily completely destroying the economy or our ability to produce energy. And if we were operating under traditional politics, right, like the way that you would address the quote unquote climate change issue would be that we maintain our current levels of oil production, but we like transition to nuclear and solar power while at the same time exporting our oil and exporting our oil technology to like sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Africa. And in doing so, not only are you still maintaining the oil energy sector of like Texas and the red states, but you're also allowing the Africans to, divest from China, invest in the United States, and modernize while at the same time the United States develops a nuclear power and solar power capacity to meet its energy needs without necessarily completely ending its dependence upon coal, natural gas, and oil. But of course, that's operating under traditional politics, and I don't think that policy would ever be expected. But yeah, the cane toad is wreaking havoc in Australia. It's a pretty interesting topic. Yeah, it is an interesting topic because there's a lot of there's like a series of children's books talking about like cane toads and getting ran over and things like that. I remember reading it as a kid. I just thought that was kind of cute. It's like 2 or 3 books written about them. I'll have to find it. Zoldor asked, but will it make the line go up though? Yeah, I think so. I've written this thing out a couple of years ago just as this thought experiment of like how can you achieve what the left wants in terms of like the issue of climate, but at the same time like not completely wrecking the red states' economies and our dependence upon oil. So I've definitely thought about it. I might do a presentation on it and just sort of give my thoughts on the transitioning away from oil question while at the same time keeping the oil industry alive. I might do that for the next stream on this sort of. So I think I'm going to make this a weekly thing. Just every Sunday, I'm going to do a different topic on foreign issues and just make it a weekly thing for you guys. Forest Bomber asks, what are my thoughts on Thought Slime? I don't really watch a lot of breadtubers, so I don't really have any thoughts upon him. I know that there are those like the Distributist and Settlers Lament that have talked about them, and I think that they do a good job responding to breadtubers like Thought Slime, but I mean, I don't pay attention to a lot of breadtubers. I don't pay attention to a lot of leftist content creators. I do follow a lot of leftist commentators on Twitter, but I have no opinion of them. I think that you're achieving a grift, and like many who are breadtubers, the only thing that I would foresee in Thought Slime's future is an eventual coming out that he's trans, because the only model of masculinity for the progressive left is that there is none. So we have to transition in order to be a politically acceptable. And that's what it is. So BreadTube is a pure grift. I don't have any more opinion on that. Your opinion on Dormant Dynasty, aka the Asian capitalists. I've not heard enough of Dormant Dynasty or them. I think you've mentioned them before in the past, but I haven't heard or watched any of their content, so I don't have an opinion. If you want to at me on Twitter, Ouchie, and just like link me a one of their videos or something that they do, I can definitely watch it and give you my thoughts. Raging Mandrill says the Sunday stream. I like it. Well, then that's what we'll call it in the future. This will be the Sunday stream, and that's what we'll do. BreadTube is whiter than a snowstorm in Antarctica, so they need to turn trans for victim points. Yeah, that's pretty much it, Shrouded Hills. They're really into the cyclic theory of history. They had an episode with Settler. Okay, well, I'll definitely give it a look. I like Settler's Lament when he's doing politics and current events topics. So, yeah, I'll give it a watch. I'll take a look at it, see what they are all about, and I'll let you know. But yeah, I'll give them a listen in the future. But that's all that I had for today. I thought that'd be fun to just sort of talk about those two foreign policy questions and issues, and then just hang out with you guys for a little bit. And of course, that's what I'll do. I'm going to make this a weekly thing. We'll call it the Sunday stream, and it'll be a good time. All right. Since that episode with Settlers Lament, I've heard nothing from them. Oh, well, hopefully they're not done, or they haven't stopped, or nothing's happened to them. BreadTube only needs to be ridiculed. I agree. GSP says, thank you for the stream. Well, thank you all for coming on. I think this has been our most popular stream so far. So I appreciate it. So with that being said, I'm going to transition to shilling for a second here. And I'm going to just shill for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap things up. So I am on Subscribestar. This is where you can find me. I wanted to give a shout out to Fokron, who is Tequila Warlord in the chat. He recently today tipped me $30, so thank you. That'll pay for my tank of gas this week when I go to work, so I appreciate it. But yeah, this is where you can find me. And of course, I'm on Twitter at 2bprudential, and of course, I'm on YouTube. I do have a BitChute account linked there as well. I'll be uploading my things there. Rub your hands together like you mean it when you shill. I don't know if you can hear it, but my hands are rubbing like the greedy little boy that I am. Shill. Tuesday, FA Tuesday says you're a trans shill. I'm only a trans shill in the way that I know that every breadtuber will eventually transition for woke political points and when their Patreons take a dip. So anytime that you see a decrease in breadtube subscribers or decrease in patrons and super chats, bam, that's when they're going to transition for that sweet, sweet leftist grift. But I'm probably going to be doing a video on that in the future where because progressives don't have a positive masculine model for like white men, that's the only option that they have. You'll never shill like Settlers Lament shills. No, and I don't plan to. I don't want to make this something where I make money. I'm happy that I am. I have 4 of you that back me, and I'm very thankful for it. And I'm glad that people have tipped me money, but I don't want to shill constantly. I like doing this because I like getting my opinions out. I like talking to you guys. So I enjoy. Although I am thinking about doing merch in the future. I have a couple of ideas where I want to do a mug with either a mug or a t-shirt with Edmund Burke's face where it just says, I tried to warn you, talking about revolution. Or maybe the meme where it shows Edmund Burke in the 4chan green text of like, if only you knew how bad things really were. I'll probably put a poll out on Twitter asking what y'all's opinion would be. Frog merch. Yes, I will probably do frog merch. Something about frog facts or something. I'll have to do that. I'll make it a mug. I will make it a mug. We'll do that. We'll have a frog mug. How's that sound? It'll be like a very angry toad or a very angry frog that just says subscribe to the Prudentialist for frog facts or something like that. It'll be cute as hell. I'll come up with some designs. We'll make that happen. I'm so glad that y'all suggested that. Are you sure you want to get into the mug business? You'll need to be careful to not have AA break your knees with economics, literatures, books. Yeah, which is why I want to do something unique. I don't want to do a mug or something like that. I want to do something that's unique enough to be, not mugs. Although I think mugs are practical. I want people to have something tangible, in my opinion. But the thing that I want the most out of anything while we're shilling and we're talking about things is just that I, more than anything, would like to hit 1,000 subscribers in the coming days and weeks. We are at 944, so we are less than 60 away from 1,000, and we already hit 1,000 followers on Twitter. So we're doing really, really well. I started this at the end of October just to talk about my thoughts. People have been asking me for years what my political opinion is, so I thought, screw it, I can make a YouTube channel like everybody else and just get my opinions out there. Y'all have been wonderful, And like I said, we're less than 60 away from 1,000. And once that happens, I can do community posts on YouTube. I don't have to make my announcements on Twitter all the time. So the guys who are subscribed on YouTube and don't follow me on Twitter or don't use Twitter, which is probably good for them. I mean, I applaud you for not having social media like that. It's a true drain. We're doing so well. And so I wanted to just take a moment to thank all of you guys for subscribing and listening and being here. You guys have been great. And yeah, so like for instance, Zoldor doesn't use Twitter. And so once I get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, bam, community posts, and we can have people aware of what I'm saying, what I'm doing, that why we're not doing Twitter. So yeah, Pedro says, I could shill for you, but only if you occasionally shill for Don the Pleb. I will always shill for Don. Don is the first person I talked to on YouTube. I hit him up on Twitter and I said, yeah, I'd love to chat with you. I put out a video the first day I talked to Don. So I am strongly on Don's side on that. So yeah, I can do that. That's not a problem. Yeah, frog supremacy. Absolutely. So yeah, but yeah, we're so close and I appreciate it. So with that being said, if you guys have any more questions or anything like that, I've got a few more minutes and then we can wrap things up for a bit. Have you considered getting a Discord? I've considered it, but I know way too many people that have had their Discord servers nuked on other like right-wing political commentary channels. That, and I know Discord can just become this hellhole, and it's another thing where like I don't have a problem with it, but at the same time, it would just be like another form of social media that I keep track on. I'm on Twitter way too much, so that would mean I'd have to be on another, and people are already on a million other Discord servers. So if I'm going to put something together, I might use Gilded or something similar. I'm also on Telegram with the same name, The Prudentialist. You can find me on Telegram there. So keep that in mind. We do need a centralized nexus of communications. I agree. I'm figuring things out. The next thing on my list to master or to learn is Urbit. I'm still figuring out Telegram. Urbit's next, so I'm going to be doing it. But yeah, Discord is gay though, and I agree. It's just a place of, I'm not a fan. It's where people groom kids. I'm not a fan. So, but for me, Telegram is next, and I'm already on Telegram, and then Urbit is the next thing to master. And if anything, I will probably be trying out creating a website or a blog. I have a Substack account created, and I have some essays that I'm going to put up there in the coming weeks. But for this week, there'll be a Monday morning musing, so that'll be coming up on Monday. And then I do have a video about the intellectual dark web, because if you've noticed the James Lindsay Alex spat that has happened on, James Lindsay sort of outed himself as one of those IDW types. As, I don't like wokeism, but liberalism and all the things that led to wokeism, I'm going to defend, while stealing all these sort of NRX talking points like an asshole. So I have a video that is scripted on that. And then on Friday, I will have my conversations about how to debate democracy, and sort of just a review of the distributists debate with Brenton Langle, excuse me. And that'll be out on Friday, just giving my thoughts on that and what Dave did really well on and what we can do to improve in the future as a community when it comes to debating the issues of democratization and democracy as overall. So yeah, I have some things in the works. And then of course, Prudent Reads, the next one, stream of Prudent Reads will be on May 1st. So that'll be Saturday, May 1st. I'm taking the month of April to read through the first volume of Decline of the West from Spengler. I just might, this is for all of you interested in live streams, I might have Aaron McIntyre on the 1st of May to discuss Spengler's Decline of the West Volume 1. So keep that in mind. And then on the 7th of April, which is a Wednesday, I should be on with Apostolic Majesty's stream, we'll be talking about Mittenrick, so that'll be a fun time. And then I will have a prominent up-and-coming Substack writer, hopefully on the 10th of April, which is a Saturday, to talk about his work and things like that. So I'll keep you all updated. But those are all of my announcements. Those are all that I have. And we are going to make this the Sunday stream, and I'll have various topics of what's going on in the world and everything like that. So things are moving on, things are growing, and I'm so glad that y'all would be able to. I wish I could interview Yarvin. The only person I want to interview Curtis Yarvin in the future Raging Man Drill is I want the distributors to interview him, because I would kind of like to see Curtis Yarvin sort of just have a conversation with this devout trad cath. And yeah, no, prog rock farmers, maybe when I'm much bigger. I'm not going to be interviewing him. I will be interviewing Apex Notes, and known as Apex Synapse on Twitter. Apex is an up and coming Substack writer. He's really, I enjoy his work, and I enjoy what he does, and he's very well versed in economics as well as the issues of sort of the post-left world. So I will be interviewing him hopefully on the 10th of April, which is a Saturday. So I will keep you apprised of the time and when that happens. Have you ever thought about reading some spicy mid-century books such as Orphans of Warsaw to increase your spice levels? I have a laundry list of spicy books from like Rogue Scholar Press and Imperium Press to be doing. So yeah. Shrouded Hill says, interview some trad wives. Are those still around? You can go to Radical Liberation for that. He's got his entire homeschooling stream with his wife. She's definitely the best trad wife. And then Default Friend got called out for by the New York Times for supporting traditionalism for women. So I mean, they're out there, and eventually I will do it. The Enemy of Europe stream win. Maybe that can be one of these Sundays. Let's get spicy. I mean, maybe I'd have to read up on that. The Prudential is the founder of frog nationalism. No, the founder of frog nationalism is BAP, but I mean, I'll happily advance its cause. But yeah, this is what's coming in the future, and this is what I have in mind. And then CC asks, do you think the USA will leave this century united? As someone who loves my country and as someone who is patriotic for what my country once stood for, I would hope so. Whether or not that remains true or not remains to be seen. We are incredibly disunited, and we live two separate lifestyles, cultures, economies. It seems to be likely that it won't. But in my heart of hearts, I hope it does. Because that's what I would like. Orphans of Versailles, but yes. I'll have to take a look at that one. And I mean, I'll, like I said, I keep reading. That's why I do Prudent Reads. I keep reading on these other things. I keep reading a lot more of my older stuff from my French postmodernist stuff. So I'll keep doing the work, and you guys encourage me to keep doing the work and to keep reading and to keep listening. And so that's what I plan to do. And I am thankful for all of y'all's support, and I am hoping to continue and to provide. So like I said, you can follow me at Twitter at 2bprudential. I have my YouTube channel. I'm trying to upload my stuff as a backups onto BitChute. I will also be looking into Rumble and Odyssey in the near future. I have my Subscribe Star, which you can find here, and I'm thankful for the backers that are supporting me. There are 4 of you now, and I'm incredibly thankful. And with that being said, everybody, I think we're going to wrap it up there. I appreciate y'all coming on for as long as you did. We had 50 people watching as our max, so that's a great improvement. And I want to thank you all so much for stopping by and listening to this little presentation. I hope that it was enjoyable. I hope it was informative, and I hope that it was able to give you something to think about when we take a look at international relations, especially with the big ticket items for us living in the States and in Western Europe. So with that, I will see you all on Monday with a Monday morning musing. So until then, enjoy your frogs, enjoy your toads. We'll talk about merch in the future. More videos to come. And as always, be prudent, everybody. You all take care. You guys have been great.